Some people rise to fame overnight. Others are allowed to rise. The difference is not talent. It is permission. At night, when the stage lights are turned off and the applause dissolves into memory, fame reveals its true shape. It is quiet. It is heavy. And it is never owned by the person standing under the spotlight. The apartment was high above the city. Too high for the noise to reach. Too quiet for sleep to come easily. Outside, billboards still carried his face. Perfect lighting. A rehearsed smile. Inside, the phone lay face down on the table. No messages. No missed calls. The silence felt intentional. We often imagine success as something loud. But the fall begins in silence. He was young, polished, marketed as untouchable. Interviews described him as disciplined, grateful, clean. The kind of figure brands trusted. The kind of face audiences projected their hopes onto. But behind closed doors, the nights grew longer. Sleep fractured into shallow hours. Anxiety arrived without warning. Sometimes he would stare at a wall and feel as though minutes had gone missing. Not forgotten. Removed. There were meetings he did not remember agreeing to. Invitations that arrived already confirmed. Contracts placed in front of him with reassuring smiles and missing numbers. No payment details, no room for negotiation. Only signatures. He was told this was normal. He was told this was protection. When pressure began to build, help appeared. Always at the right moment. Consultants. Advisors. People who spoke softly and never used names. They offered stability, guidance, something they called balance. One of them left behind a small object after a visit. Nothing dramatic, something personal. A charm. It was said to bring calm. That was when the dream started. They were not violent. They were disorienting. Repetitive corridors. Locked doors. Applause echoing from rooms he could not enter. Each morning he woke with the same sensation, that something had already happened and he had been absent for it. We have been taught to see collapse as spectacle. Public scandals. Explosive headlines. But there is another kind of destruction. Quieter. Slower. Executed with precision. His schedule changed without explanation. Projects disappeared from public listings. Endorsements quietly withdrew. Online data shifted. Search results altered. It was subtle enough to be deniable. Severe enough to be effective. When he asked questions, the answers were calm. Technical issues. Market adjustments. Temporary pauses. He was advised to rest, to stay silent, to trust the process. That was the first rule he learned. Silence was not a choice. It was a requirement. We will tell you this story without accusations, without conclusions, only with patterns, only with what can be observed when enough similar stories are placed side by side. Because what happened to him was not unique. And what he did not realize was that his career was no longer being managed. It was being monitored. The first thing to change was not his work. It was the narrative around him. At a glance, nothing appeared wrong. His name still existed. His past performances were still accessible. Old interviews continued to circulate. But the present began to thin out. Invitations stopped arriving. Mentions slowed, then stalled. It was as if the digital world had quietly agreed to look elsewhere. This is how control operates in modern entertainment. Not through force, but through absence. We trace the pattern across multiple cases. The sequence rarely varies. An artist reaches a level where autonomy becomes possible. At that point, adjustments begin. Data shifts. Algorithms reorient. Public interest is not destroyed. It is redirected. One morning, his team informed him that a scheduled appearance had been postponed. No reason given. The following week, 2 projects were listed as under review. Then a brand partnership quietly ended. No announcement, no explanation. When asked, representatives cited internal restructuring. The language was always neutral, polite, final. What makes this method effective is deniability. Each individual change appears reasonable. Together, they form a pattern that leaves no visible hand. He attempted to maintain normal routines. Training, rehearsals, media preparation. But momentum had already been interrupted. Without access, without exposure, visibility becomes a memory. And in entertainment, memory fades quickly. The isolation was systematic. Messages from colleagues grew cautious. Some stopped responding altogether. Others spoke in vague reassurances, never committing to plans. Conversations ended with phrases like, "not now," or "later this year," timelines that never arrived. He was advised again to remain quiet. We have seen this silence mistaken for recovery. In reality, it functions as containment. Online, small inconsistencies emerged. Search results no longer prioritized recent achievements. Trending lists adjusted unpredictably. Fan discussions encountered moderation delays. Content was not removed. It was buried. Just deep enough to avoid attention. He noticed it before anyone explained it to him. The realization did not come with panic. It came with clarity. This was not backlash. There had been no public scandal. No statement. No accusation. There was nothing to defend against. And that was the problem. Without a visible charge, there could be no response. When he finally asked who was responsible, the answer was indirect. These things happen. The market is unstable. You should focus on your health. The advice was consistent across sources that appeared unrelated. Management consultants, media strategists, crisis advisors who insisted there was no crisis. All delivered the same instruction in different words. Wait. Trust. Do not speak. This is the stage where many artists comply, believing restraint will restore balance. But balance is not the goal. We spoke with individuals who had worked behind the scenes for years. Their descriptions align. Once an artist is flagged, activity does not cease. It is observed, monitored, evaluated. Each reaction is measured. Emotional responses are noted. Private communications are archived. At this stage, control is psychological. He began to question his own perceptions. Was he imagining the pattern? Was the silence simply coincidence? That doubt is critical. Because once uncertainty replaces confidence, compliance becomes easier. What remained constant was the presence of intermediaries. People who checked in, who reassured him that he was protected. They discouraged independent action. They emphasized patience. They framed resistance as self-destruction. Behind every reassurance was an unspoken implication. Non-cooperation would worsen the situation. This is not discipline. It is conditioning. He was not threatened. No ultimatums were issued. Instead, he was reminded of how fragile visibility can be. How quickly public favor shifts. How easily momentum disappears when support systems disengage. The lesson was implicit, but unmistakable. Reputation is not earned. It is leased. Once this stage is reached, recovery no longer depends on talent or effort. It depends on alignment, on obedience, on accepting guidance without questions. And this is where many artists vanish. Not physically, professionally. Their faces remain familiar. Their names still circulate. But their agency is gone. Silence, he learned, was not absence. It was enforcement. By the time he understood that reputation could be withdrawn, the structure behind it began to surface. Not as an organization, not as a single authority, but as a network. It did not introduce itself directly. It revealed itself through repetition. The same names appearing across unrelated meetings. The same firms listed in contracts that claimed independence. The same intermediaries quietly bridging gaps between management, production, and distribution. Everything appeared legal, properly formatted, carefully distanced. We reviewed agreements that never mentioned ownership, only cooperation. Services rendered without clear scope. Advisory roles without defined responsibility. Each document stood on its own. Together they formed a closed loop. This is how influence survives scrutiny. Fragmented, distributed, plausibly innocent. He was encouraged to sign revised contracts. Temporary adjustments, they said. Short-term sacrifices for long-term stability. The numbers were vague. Compensation deferred. Rights reassigned. He was assured that this was standard practice for artists in transition. What he did not realize was that transition had no end date. The companies involved were unfamiliar to him. New names, new logos. But their representatives spoke with confidence. They knew his schedule, his habits, his concerns. They referenced private conversations he did not remember sharing. That was when he understood the imbalance. He was visible. They were not. We spoke with former insiders who described the same structure. A tiered system of access. At the surface, management. Beneath it, financial handlers. Beneath them, private consultants specializing in risk mitigation. Each layer insulated the one below it. Artists never reached the center. They orbit it. Payment structures reflected this design. Revenue moved through multiple entities before reaching the performer. By the time it arrived, it had been reduced to a stipend. Enough to survive, not enough to leave. Public perception suggested wealth. Reality enforced dependence. This is why many artists appear prosperous but cannot act independently. Their assets are controlled through obligations they cannot break without consequence. Attempts to renegotiate trigger reviews. Reviews trigger delays. Delays trigger silence. The system does not punish defiance immediately. It documents it. At this stage, surveillance becomes routine. Private communications are archived. Emotional fluctuations are noted. Stress responses are categorized. This data is not collected for legal purposes. It is collected for leverage. He began to sense it in subtle ways. Conversations that ended abruptly when he entered a room. Meetings that shifted tone after he expressed doubt. Advisors who stopped offering options and began offering warnings disguised as concern. They reminded him of others. Careers that had collapsed naturally. Opportunities that failed to materialize. Accidents that were never explained. No threats were issued. None were necessary. What binds the system together is mutual interest. Investors protect capital. Producers protect schedules. Distributors protect access. The artist protects survival. When one element resists, the others adjust to compensate. This creates the illusion of inevitability. One former executive described it simply. Once the network decides you are unstable, everything you do becomes evidence. Silence is interpreted as guilt. Speech is interpreted as instability. Compliance is interpreted as recovery. There is no action that restores autonomy. Only actions that delay removal. He was advised to attend private sessions. Wellness consultations. Emotional recalibration, they called it. These meetings were informal, confidential. No records. The goal was clarity, alignment, acceptance. He left these sessions feeling calm, detached, less inclined to question. That frightened him more than the pressure, because it meant the system did not rely on force. It relied on exhaustion, on repetition, on wearing down resistance until compliance felt like relief. We must be precise here. This is not conspiracy. It is infrastructure. An infrastructure designed to manage risk. And in this context, the artist is the risk. Once this stage is reached, departure becomes nearly impossible. Contracts bind time. Obligations bind silence. Reputation binds obedience. The network does not need to act. It only needs to wait. They did not threaten him. They reminded him. There is a point where management ends and belief begins. It rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as care. When pressure no longer produced compliance, the language shifted. Meetings became more intimate. The rooms quieter. The assurances softer. He was told that what he was experiencing was not professional. It was internal, emotional imbalance, fatigue, disconnection from self. They offered solutions that did not involve contracts. Private consultations, confidential guidance, practices meant to restore focus and clarity. No paperwork, no formal titles, just people who claimed to understand the weight he carried. This is where accounts begin to diverge. Some describe relief. Others describe fear. What remains consistent is the loss of agency. The sessions emphasized surrender, letting go of resistance, trusting unseen processes. He was encouraged to stop asking why and focus on alignment. To accept that struggle indicated misdirection. One consultant introduced a ritualized routine. Breathing exercises. Objects placed deliberately within the room. Symbols described as grounding. None were overtly alarming. Each was framed as optional, therapeutic. But repetition gives meaning. Over time, he noticed changes in his responses. Situations that once angered him now felt distant. Decisions that once mattered no longer did. Memory softened at the edges. Certain conversations blurred. Others disappeared entirely. He was not instructed to forget. He simply stopped remembering. Former staff members who later came forward described similar methods. Not as superstition, but as psychological conditioning reinforced through symbolism. The goal was not belief. It was compliance through detachment. Once emotional resistance weakens, control becomes effortless. He began to dream less. When he did, the dreams were structured. Familiar corridors, repeated phrases, The sensation of being watched without hostility. Observation without judgment. That calm was the warning. During this period, another artist died. The announcement was brief. The cause was unclear, but unchallenged. Industry responses were uniform, respectful, controlled. No questions, no investigations, only condolences and silence. Those who knew the artist described a different story. Increasing isolation, sudden behavioral changes, withdrawal, confusion, the same pattern, the same timeline. We do not claim causation. We observe correlation. In private, he asked if resistance had consequences. The answer was indirect. He was reminded of fragility, of how stress manifests physically, of how easily accidents occur when one is unbalanced. The implication was not hidden. It was normalized. From this point forward, autonomy was no longer discussed. Only safety, stability, survival. The consultants reduced contact. The advisors checked in less frequently. Silence returned heavier than before. This silence did not punish. It waited. He understood then that compliance was no longer the objective. He had already been neutralized. The system does not require obedience from everyone. Only from those who remain visible. Others serve a different function. They become examples. The artist who died was not erased. His name remained. His work continued to circulate. But his absence became instructive. A reminder delivered without words. Some artists disappear quietly. Others are turned into warnings. By the end, there were no villains to confront. No offices to expose. No documents that could be leaked to end it all. That is the most unsettling truth. What we uncovered was not a single scheme, but a condition. A system that functions precisely because it does not require belief, loyalty, or cruelty. Only participation. Only silence. In the entertainment world, success is framed as freedom. In practice, it is leverage. Visibility invites attention. Attention invites management. Management invites control. At no point is consent formally withdrawn. It is simply outpaced. The artist at the center of this story did not vanish. He continued to exist, to appear, to perform when permitted, to smile when required. From the outside, recovery seemed possible, even likely, but recovery was never the goal. What was taken from him could not be measured in contracts or public metrics. It was the ability to decide when to speak, when to leave, when to remember. The most effective systems do not destroy people. They reframe them. We reviewed enough cases to confirm one pattern above all others. Those who attempted to confront the structure were not confronted in return. They were reframed, labeled unstable, difficult, unreliable. Over time, their credibility eroded faster than their claims could spread. Others complied, quietly, strategically. They survived by narrowing their lives until survival itself became the achievement. There are no headlines for that. The presence of belief-based practices, ritualized care, or symbolic conditioning does not require proof to be effective. Their function is not to convince, but to exhaust, to blur boundaries, to detach resistance from identity. Once doubt turns inward, the system no longer needs to act. This is where many stories end, with ambiguity, with unanswered questions. with a familiar face fading from relevance while remaining unmistakably present. We do not offer conclusions, only observations. Fame, when centralized, becomes a gate. Gates require keepers. Keepers do not need to announce themselves. They only need to decide who passes and who waits. And waiting can last a lifetime. If you are looking for justice, this story will disappoint you. Justice implies resolution. What exists here is continuity. Because as long as visibility can be granted and withdrawn without explanation, control does not need to be enforced. It only needs to be accepted. And if fame can be taken away so easily, the question is not who controls it. The question is who survives it.